I'm Bryce Butler from Access Ventures, and this is More Than Profit, a show where I talk with founders, investors, entrepreneurs, and leaders of all kinds about living and working with purpose, how they do it, and why. Foundations traditionally have grant staff and endowment investment staff that typically operate entirely independent of one another. So what happens when foundations move beyond this kind of two-pocket approach or mindset to a one-pocket approach? On today's show, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Stephanie Gripne, founder and CEO of the Impact Finance Center, to help us answer some of these questions and further explain the benefits of what she refers to as full spectrum capital. If you're not familiar with Stephanie, it's important to note that she is the creative force behind the National Impact Investment Marketplace, with a goal to catalyze $1 trillion in investment capital into social ventures by replicating and scaling the infrastructure that she helped pilot in Colorado. We kicked off today's episode by learning a little bit more about her backstory and what brought her to this work.
I have actually been doing a lot of reflecting about how I came to be and where I found myself in this space right now. And there is no question my family goes back 4 generations, Colorado, but my family ran away. My parents ran away from their parents. And I was born up in Port Angeles, Washington, which is kind of come full circle. I'm working on a sustainable forestry project with the Forest Service right now. And they decided that a 24-hour drive was too far to be away from their family. But they didn't want to get too close. So halfway between Port Angeles and Colorado is Idaho. And so I grew up in Idaho. Huh. And my parents, while they were married, they divorced when I was 8. We moved to Boise. And my dad was a business, finance, accounting, big-hearted workout guy. He would do workouts of companies. And as I've had the joy of being an MBA professor, I really asked myself, is the skill set of being an entrepreneur, of working at a business, is that something that you're born with? Or is it something you're trained to do? Does it come from your family? Because I didn't spend a tremendous amount of time with my dad after my parents' divorce. And my mom was brave, and she moved us up to central Idaho, outside of Sun Valley, Idaho, Haley, Idaho. She was a dietitian, worked for the school district. And I think my commitment to service came from my mom. And my dad was a very big-hearted, social-minded person. He would secretly, if somebody lost their job, he would anonymously get Christmas presents for the whole family or something like that.
Wow.
And but my dad also, when I was 12 or 13, he had been doing workouts of companies, and he came across a precast concrete company and decided, he and his partner Jim took it out of bankruptcy and became the preeminent precast concrete company in Idaho. So I grew up around my dad's shop, when I was visiting him, and a par 3 golf course. And he he offered me my first stepping stone business, my first business when I was 12.
What was
that? A side hustle stepping stone business. So
okay.
we'd make large precast concrete.
Oh, okay, awesome. Like literally stepping
products.
stones.
Yeah, stepping stones. And my mom didn't think a 12-year-old should be running their own business, but I really wanted to do it. And then he had me invest in Micron when I was 13. And then I bought the Motley Fool book and started doing drip investing, direct stock purchasing, 15, 16, 17. I bought Enron because it was renewable energy stock. And living up in the central mountains of Idaho, everybody's connected to natural resources. And I loved people on both sides of the issue. Wolves were being reintroduced. We had an endangered salmon, spring, summer Chinook salmon. And my community members would literally threaten the lives of those protecting the resources versus those that were going to benefit from the river being shut down, like the river guides. And literally the river guides would threaten the lives of the fisheries biologists. And I worked for both of them, loved both of them. It was always about wildlife for me. And it took me a long time to realize that it's not about the wildlife. It was just this resource allocation issue. There wasn't enough. And it was either the wildlife or the community. And I just knew way back when that there was enough. We just had a resource allocation problem. The pipes weren't flowing in the right way. And so that kind of led me on my journey. I announced when I was 16 years old, 17, that I was going to become a carpenter, like my dad said. seriously? How about architect, your class secretary, salutatorian, captain of three sports? And I said, how about wildlife biologist? And he said, Stephanie, he said, you have a mind for business. Go make money and have influence. And I said, Dad, I don't have the constitution to do what you did. I have to be aligned with my values. And so I had a whole early career in natural resources. Devin Thorpe, when he was a contributing writer for Forbes, he had a fun headline that said, am I this next wildlife conservation PhD, the next Steve Jobs of impact investing? And that conversation would come full circle back with my dad. My dad was a functional alcoholic and would end up, when his business was sold and then my sister and I had gone to college, ended up becoming homeless in my early 20s and came back to live with me and my partner at the time as grad students. And the last 5 years of his life, I said, we were living in Lander, Wyoming, and I was working on my PhD and working for the Forest Service in 7 states. And my mom was actually sick with pancreatic cancer in Idaho.
Goodness.
And my dad, I said he had to get a job or volunteer, and he lived in the actual house in our home, and he got a mortgage broker license and a real estate license. And so we bought one house and then a second house, and it became more fun, instead of giving him an allowance, to buy another house, to cobble together $5,000 to $6,000 and buy a $120,000 house. So that's when I learned about real estate. And he came home one day and he said, hey, there's all these families. They had great credit. They didn't have the proper health insurance. And so they ended up in a medical bankruptcy.
Wow.
And so they're 1, 2, 3, 5 years away from buying a house or a car. What if you buy the house and lease option it to them? And so we kind of had this family meeting of how much is enough financial return for us? And how much are we willing to share? Yeah. And we agreed on 10%. We said 10% of their rent they can have as partial equity. And if the house appreciates above 10%, they get to keep the upside. And most of the houses appreciated 15 to 25%. And so, it started off a job for my dad, then a joy of philanthropy, then amazing tenant, and the concept that people could, regain dignity, get their home, and get partial equity and upside. And that's when that larger conversation of my dad and my mom's service ethic and my entrepreneurial self kind of catalyzed. And I haven't looked back 300 transactions ago.
What helped shape your this creativity? Looking at, friend of mine runs Creative Mornings, if you're familiar with it. And here in Louisville, it's an international, basically monthly breakfast talk. They have like 180 chapters around the world, and they get different creatives together, and they talk on a common theme every month at each of the chapters. And what they do is they find someone from the local community that can speak to that theme, and they interpret that theme in any way that they can. But part of the gathering that's really profound that I think is really fascinating is they talk about the fact that all of us were born creative, but at some point along our journey, people tell us we're not. Because creativity, one, it's like the artist, or, what you think about is more the fine arts. But as I listen to you, and as you and I have had multiple conversations before, you light up and the way you think about balance sheets and financial statements, or the creativity around finance, is just amazing. And I'm just like, where did that come from in your growing up journey?
There's a couple pieces, I think, later in life, but earlier in life, I want to give credit to a couple of junior high and high school teachers and my science teachers. Patty Lucene, she did experiential education for my 9th grade science class. And it was really traumatic for me because I'd been going to school in Boise, Idaho, and I'd mastered learning from a book. But add in uncertainty, a backpacking trip, building a nature trail, doing an avalanche rescue, learning by doing, was profound. It was scary. It was hard. I wasn't good at it. I ironically was feeling I can remember being very stressed out about not, I remember we were 14 and she's asking questions about who's reading the news and CFCs and chlorofluorocarbons. And I didn't read the news. I wasn't 14 years old doing that. And Irene Healy, our physics teacher, had a similar approach. I think learning by doing, if you read, I've read Stroke of Insight about the Harvard researcher that had a stroke. We need to basically, our brains are still malleable and we can rewire how we think about things. And part of that is you have to learn by doing in safe, low cost, fun opportunities. And so experiential education is very much what we do now of how do you change a donor to become an investor? You give them that backpacking experience. You help them learn how to make their first couple investments for low cost, no cost, in a fun social way. So certainly want to give credit to those teachers. My dad also just was very creative in how he thought of things. And I didn't spend a ton of time with him in that way. So I don't know if I inherited that or that was a part of it. One thing I want to give credit to is that there was a district ranger, Alan Pinkerton, and I interviewed him when I was 16. And he said, I can't wait to work for you or take a class from you or be on your team. And I was 16 years old and he genuinely meant it. And they talk a lot about kids struggling through depression or just one person believing in you can change your how you see yourself and your willingness to keep going. And I look at Alan wasn't that for me. Alan was that you are special and you can do anything. And he believed it. And I started believing him in myself. And the last piece I'll give credit to, I took a CO Berkman test, and it measures your aptitude for lots of things. So it's interesting when you were talking about creatives, because until I took this Berkman test a few years ago, my number one and tied for second aptitudes, number one is persuasion and tied for second is music and service. And I didn't identify as being musical or creative. I now ballroom dance. I now write songs, and I didn't do it until some silly test told me I actually had that skill. In that skill set, it also said science was a low aptitude for me, which I went to school for 12 years as an ecologist, mathematical ecologist and forest economist. And I also want to give, it's interesting, my mom passed from pancreatic cancer, and my PhD advisor was my hero. When I was 19, I was a wildland firefighter. And that was the first time the chief of the Forest Service was not a forester. It was a wildlife biologist. And he'd come from leading the spotted owl, which was the issue that really, the Bush-Clinton Perot election came down to was Oregon and Washington and how they managed the spotted owl. And Dr. Jack Roy Thomas was the leading wildlife biologist. And Clinton actually kind of broke ranks and made that wildlife biologist the chief of the Forest Service. It was the first time an ologist had been chief. And so it kind of brought in ecosystem management into the agency. And I have to give credit to the ecologist mathematical training, because, when I explain what I do now, I just had a large cultural institution come to me that has a $40 million budget, and they'll be bankrupt in about 6 months. And they said, should we do a social impact bond? It was Friday night, 5:30 p.m. And I said, well, you can think of me as an integrated doc. I'm not the specialist doc, I'm the integrated doctor. And I got this bag of medicine or tools. And this bag of medicine, a social impact bond, is one of my 70 medicines I have in my bag. And I'm not going to tell you what medicine you need till we do a workup. We need to actually unpack you a little bit and probably spend 2 half days looking at sources and uses of capital. And we did some mini versions of that just in an hour on a Friday night. And I went from like a big gulp of your expenditure rate per day is $160,000. You're going to be short 18 million by the end of the year, to, hey, here's 6 pathways we can solve this problem.
Yeah.
And then that led to the conversation of, okay, if you're having this problem, every significant cultural institution in Colorado is having this problem, as well as in the country. How do we scale this learning and solution solving quickly because we have 5 to 8 months to solve
Yeah.
this problem. So I think training as a landscape ecologist, mathematical ecologist, and we'd study the actual wildlife critter, but I was really more at the population community level and the landscape level. And I think that's kind of the approach I take to the financial systems is just like, wait, it's flow, it's rivers of capital and flow and energy.
Well, I want to go back to that aptitude test, because I think when you said that your science was low, it's really interesting because it kind of piqued in me. I mean, you have your PhD in college. I mean, like you've gone on and mastered by all accounts a field of science. How much of that is due to your drive? Because we're going to get to the Impact Finance Center here in just a second, but there's got to be things in your own professional journey that have been either roadblocks that have been in place because of systemic issues or cultural issues, or naysayers that just don't believe things. But what I've always experienced in our conversations is just you never accept those. Which is an amazing quality. So, when you said that science was like low on your aptitude, I was like, oh, that makes total sense, because she's just going to push through it and prove everybody that she can do it. So I'm curious, are there a couple of, before we get to the IFC, kind of in building your professional profile and your understanding of, and taking this ecology research and background and training into kind of what you do now, what are some of the roadblocks that you've experienced that you just basically say, nope, I'm not gonna accept that. I'm gonna, push that down?
There's a lot of interesting flashes of my life that came to me as you were asking me that question. One, I want to give credit to Sonia Neuenhaus. I've been part of 4 leadership fellowships in my life. And one is more like libertarian, one is environmental social justice, one is the Boone and Crockett Club, one was a Ford Foundation Community Forestry Research Fellowship. And those 4 fellowships have by far been my greatest source of learning, in part because you have these peer networks of learning across difference. And the Ford Foundation Community Forestry Research Fellowship taught me about participatory action research. And you can get a PhD now without taking a philosophy of science class, which is really important to teach you how people learn and know and what knowledge is and who has the right to create knowledge. And I was a budding technocrat without knowing what a technocrat was. And that's very dangerous, to have technocrats being grown without them realizing that they're a technocrat, and what is the role of science versus what is the role of a conversation, and does a rancher or forester have the right to produce knowledge if they don't have PhDs and letters behind their name? So I'm really grateful for that Ford Foundation Fellowship. In Environmental Leadership Program Fellowship, I got to know Sonia Neuenhaus, who's the top green building expert in Wisconsin. And 2003, I lose my mom to pancreatic cancer. 2005, I turn in my PhD, my doctorate, my dissertation, and I come down to Colorado to celebrate Denver. And my dad passes within those 2 years. And Sonia and a bunch of my ELP fellows came out probably 5 or 6 days later for a ranch project I had as part of that fellowship. And then 2 months later, around early January, late December, she calls, and she's originally from Denmark. So it's like, hey, Sonia, or it's Stephanie. I'm like, hey, Sonia, how's it going? And she's like, I've made 2 decisions. You need to change your career. So I just graduated with my PhD. I have a job with the Forest Service on a really cool enterprise team. I'm exhausted. And a dear peer mentor of mine calls, and she says, I need to switch my career into real estate. And I was like a real estate agent? What are you thinking here, Sonia? And then the second thing she says, and I've made another decision. You need to quit your job. You have to have some pain. You won't have the courage to figure out your path unless you have some pain associated with it.
Wow.
And I said, well, I'm a daughter of a single mom. I just don't go quit my job. But I really took what she said to heart. And so I quit my job part-time with a goal of ending it. And I started to basically do, like a researcher, informational interviews about where forestry and real estate overlapped. And so, my first call was Peter Stein at Lime Timber, and started figuring out that pathway. And by the end of that 6-month journey, had a decision to join the Nature Conservancy as a director of science or a real estate shop kind of at the manager level. And I chose to, I knew I needed a lot more transaction experience to keep furthering my direction. I knew going back to school was not an option for me at that point. And so I joined the Nature Conservancy in Colorado as a land conservation program manager, and was given a $18.1 million ranch that was going up for auction in 45 days as my first project. And if I knew now, but I didn't know then, it takes 7 years to get projects like that approved at the Nature Conservancy, and for them to finally get approved. And so we had a couple late nights. People generally at the Nature Conservancy are not working all-nighters on anything. But it just confirmed, some people don't like when I say I'm a deal junkie, but I love transactions. I love them. They're like an analytical puzzle piece with a deadline.
Yeah, for sure.
And I love doing that. So I think that's a big piece of what's motivated me. And then losing my parents in my 20s, and they were 56 and 58. There's that saying, they say life is short, which is trite until you realize life is so short.
Yeah.
And my parents, when I look at them, they did the best they could. And I feel like they had a lot of unleft living. And I remember thinking, I don't want to get to 50. I want to get to 56 and think, wow, I left it all on the table. Yeah. And every other day is bonus after that. And so I realized I was living afraid and scared and afraid of what people would think of me, and that I'd be a disruptor, or lots of other unsavory words that would come my way. And I realized that, it melted it, from being afraid to risk loving. And I'm still afraid. I just force myself to jump off that cliff every day. Yeah.
It's interesting because I think when you're younger, you have this invincibility, because, life, that's that person's old. Even in their 50s, sometimes that feels like they're older. But when you're, as an adult, I'm sure you've lost friends as well to cancer or other things in their 30s with young families. Or my wife lost her mom last year. She was in her 70s, but she had many years of life left, and so it's like, all of a sudden you're faced with this mortality, and you're just like, okay, what am I going to do? And then I read, I don't know if you ever read Howard Buffett's book, 40 Chances. He has a foundation that focuses on ending world hunger. And so he kind of took this principle from a seed salesman that he says a farmer typically has 40 chances to get a harvest right. Because if you think about when they take over the farm and then when they pass the farm on, they have 40 harvests. And he looked at it like, okay, so what are you doing with your 40 chances? Every year, you're out there to kind of build this great harvest, provide for your family, provide for your community. And so he profiled people around the country, and you look at, okay, if I have 40 chances, how many chances do I have left? I'm almost 40, and looking back at, okay, how many of those chances have I used wisely? Have I taken risks to deploy my skills, if you will? So it's really fascinating. I want to shift into your work at Impact Finance Center and the full spectrum capital partners stuff, because I think what you're doing there is pretty fascinating. At Access Ventures, we talk about like the one pocket mindset. I think full spectrum capital, kind of synonymous in ways, but I found this quote from Peter Lupoff from the Net Impact about you, and it completely resonated with me. It says, Stephanie is a creative whirlwind, not only capable of identifying unique solutions to address the world's most pressing problems and those that ease systemic or organization impediments and dysfunction, but she has a history of successful execution as well. And I love that first part, creative whirlwind, because I think every time you and I chat, I leave motivated, inspired, and like feeling like I just got out of, the rapids in my kayak, which is great. I think that's a great gift and quality. And I think you've taken that a lot into the Impact Finance Center. So talk to me about how your life and ecology work Nature Conservancy, real estate, and all, kind of taking you to where you are, and what you're trying to do with Impact Finance Center and Full Spectrum Capital.
Thanks. I'd love to even add on a little piece at the end of your last question for this piece of it, because when I realized about these decisions, when my parents passed, or when they were passing, I wanted to take care of them. So you had to do that. When I graduated from my undergrad in wildlife, I was thinking about going to the Peace Corps or doing something, fun but very quickly, my dad had said he would pay off my student loans, and he was now homeless. And so I was forced to defer my student loans. So it's interesting because I don't think I ever would have even gone for my PhD had I not been kind of forced into grad school or the Peace Corps with a bunch of student loans as a wildlife. I'd given up my scholarship at a liberal arts school. And then an opportunity while I was doing my master's degree came up to study with my hero, and he was 67. So it wasn't like I could wait 5 years.
Yeah, for sure.
Like it was now or then. And so when, all of those risks kind of all of those hardships opened up opportunities for sure. So I lost my mom, my dad, and my 10-year relationship within about 4 years. And I joined a $100 million private equity fund, and that was a joint venture eco products fund. And we were doing environmental markets in biodiversity, wetlands, water, and carbon. So I got to work on some of the first credit markets back in DC. And that was right before the last Great Recession, 2007. And I was running away from my life. Let's make no bones about it. I was going to do it. And it was the first time I think I had the sense that the people in the private sector were smarter. And I didn't know if I was smart enough, and what really is this stuff in private equity, and how does this work? And it was a really interesting experience. And I was the operations manager for that. And I was also the operations, really COO for our internal Forest Service consulting firm, which is hilarious because I would never hire me to be an ops anything. But I think as a business development CEO, like I'm a great person to partner with the ops person, because I do see value in that, in having those systems in place. But I remember writing down on a piece of paper when I was intellectually bored when I was the operations manager in Washington, D.C. And so I started teaching environmental markets class online at Virginia Tech at 2008. And I believe in getting clarity on your vision. And when you get clarity, you can work towards it in such a more profound way. And I realized my dream job was 10% teaching, 10% applied research, and 80% transactions for good. And so I wrote down that job description, and I get a phone call from University of Colorado, and they said, "Why don't you apply for the job?" And I said, no offense, my dad told me to go into the private sector, and I'm finally having the courage to do that. And they said, "Well, tell me what you want to do." And I said, "Well, 80% of my time I want to do transactions for good, 10% research and teaching. So I'll volunteer, teach a class or something like that." And they said, "Stephanie, I don't know if you know this or not, but a lot of universities have a huge real estate portfolio through acquisitions from their president's headquarters to affordable housing to bequests. And some universities actually take that real estate and pull it out into a separate foundation. And so we'd like to hire you through the University of Colorado Real Estate Foundation. We have $90 million in assets. We'll give you a carve off to do transactions. We'll make you an assistant professor in finance, a joint. And through the center, the real estate center, we'll make you director of the Initiative for Sustainable Real Estate Development. So teach one MBA class,
done, do
a little research, and do transactions for good." I was like, "Thank you. No, thank you. Academics is backwards." And I went home and I was like, "Wait a minute. They just offered me what's on this piece of paper."
Wow.
And so I joined, there was a shift in leadership. The person who brought me in left right away. And so we never fully got that program going in the way it could have gotten. However, it was there I discovered so many things, that the financial return of a grant is negative 100%. That learning by doing is really important. You've got to baby step people along the way. That the lack of our royal we attention to train the money in non-conflicted, low-cost ways. Like, we assume the money knows what it's doing because it has the money, but they need training just as a social venture needs training. All of those things came to pass there. And I remember 2010 to 12, I was there 3 years. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, every entrepreneurship center needs an innovative finance center. How many entrepreneurship centers are there? Thousands. And then I thought, oh, every community foundation needs an innovative finance center. Every association of foundations needs it. Every chamber of commerce. And I was like, how are we going to do this? There's only 15 of us. And so that was the concept of, we've got to create a center in a box. So now I'm fearless because have had all this loss, and so I kind of took some of my retirement dollars and started a nonprofit impact finance center with the goal to be a multi-university academic center, which was piloted at University of Denver and Virginia Tech, and now we're at the New School. So that's where that concept came up of, we've got to create this curriculum, this education and technical assistance in a non-conflicted way, and then figure out long-term a B2B partnership model.
That's great. I'm curious if you could explain some of so there's two questions. One is impact investing or impact finance center. I think sometimes those terms get muddied because they take on a different meaning for different people. Help us understand what you mean by impact and where you see that going. Because like some people we've talked with, they would talk about like, okay, all investments have impact, and that eventually and inevitably the goal would be we would drop this modifier and we just are thinking more thoughtfully and intentionally about how we invest. So I'd love to hear your perspective on that. If there's staying power for this, or if really ultimately the goal is to continue to move people in the direction of more alignment. And then second to that, like this notion of full spectrum capital, like how do you do that? How do you work with these organizations to help them move from what they have historically done, which is this bifurcated approach to money management, and whether that's education or impact? What have you found to be the most impactful, for lack of a better word, ways to help them move in that direction?
Great questions. The first question, I'm going to base a real life case study, but I'm going to keep the names anonymous to protect the innocent. But it's a full spectrum capital project. And so in October of this year, we have Full Spectrum Capital Partners is a partnership that is led by Taj James out of the Movement Strategy Center, and us at Impact Finance Center, and an organization called Dev Labs, Ruben Hernandez, and they're a venture capital tech firm. And that effort is unlocking full spectrum capital and really supporting what we call community stewards, people that are just rock stars. And when I think of a community steward, they have their own social venture, but they're also holding that space for everybody else, somebody like you, Bryce. And so we have identified probably 60 community stewards in the Americas that need support. And one of those community stewards is this amazing woman, Anasa Troutman, out of Memphis. And her story is unbelievable, and I'm not going to do it justice right now, but she grew up outside of New Jersey, amazing activist family, went to Spelman, and with the concept of, I'm going to find my people. And she was there and going to classes, and some of her classmates are like, well, we can't go on the wrong side of the tracks. We're going to get mugged by the people in the hoodies. And so talk about understanding issues of race and class in a way that most of us could not experience or understand. And so she ended up saying, to no surprise, finding her people in the creatives. And so she started a record label, I believe at 22. India Arya was her first breakthrough artist. She was asked to come back to historic Claiborne Temple, which is ground zero of the sanitation worker strike and the I Am a Man speech, where Martin Luther King Jr. was shot 4 blocks away on that project. And she was asked to come back. Historic Claiborne Temple was kind of ground zero where 3 different protests were led. And she was asked to write a musical for the 50-year anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. And she ended up also kind of being asked to stay in Memphis and to acquire this historic Claiborne temple for a little over $1 million and come up with a $50 million plan to continue the work of Reverend Lawson and Reverend King on worker ownership and community ownership as a way to solve race and class issues. And so how could she acquire this temple, put it into people of color ownership, and literally restore the temple, repair it, and activate it with creatives and interfaith and continue on the stream. And so we were brought in October to support her coming up to the last mile of acquisition. We had to come up with $1.3 million in 2 months, and through and literally a week before I'm going out to Memphis for the first time, I get a call from a family foundation, and they said, "Is there somebody like you in Memphis that can teach our family how to do what you do?" And I said, "You know what? I'm going to be in Memphis on Tuesday." And they said, "Our family foundation meeting's on Tuesday. Can you come out early?" And I said, "Absolutely." And, like most families, they're complex, and part of them are progressive and part of them are conservative. And so how do you thread the needle? How do you teach impact investing to a really diverse crowd like that? And who I'm talking to, I probably have 50 different ways to teach it based on who you are. So that's the bigger the crowd, the more ineffective I am.
Yeah.
But in this particular audience, I said, I'm not that different than you. I have a holding nonprofit with multiple social enterprises. You have a holding company in your family, and their grandfather, who had started their family company and foundation, essentially there was a billboard that said, "Do more positive things in Memphis." And he'd gotten a start with a financial partner. He was the son of a single mom, a widowed mom, I believe. So he didn't have a lot of money. And so I walked them through, and I said, people will say impact investing is complicated. I said, "Is it?" And I said, your grandfather and his money partner, that's called relationship investing. And the next slide was the picture of do more positive things in Memphis. I said, "Do you know what impact investing is? It's doing more positive things in Memphis with your money in relationship to others." Mm. And our biggest donor, my biggest donor, his grandfather came from Memphis too. And so I put his picture up. I'm like, the grandfather? And they're like, "Yes." I said, "His grandson is my money partner." Hmm. So instead of, we basically are creating community infrastructure that we can share and cross over. And I'd say, 100 years ago, Bryce, you'd be the farmer. I'd be at the mercantile. Your crops would be late. And you'd come into the store and say, "Hey, can I have an extension on my credit?" And I would say, "Yes." And most people on Wall Street would say there were problems about that transaction around risk. And I would say 85% of that transaction was perfect and beautiful. 15% was problematic. And the risk issues were geographic risk, sector risk, diversification risk. But instead of us fixing that small piece of the problem of that transaction, we just threw the 85% of what was right and beautiful out. And now most of us can't look somebody in the eyes on the other side of our 401k or our IRA. And we call it Main Street 2.0. We said, what's great about Wall Street is that you're really good at measuring and pricing risk. So we can swing the pendulum back to Main Street, look each other in the eye, and now we can price and measure risk. And we can actually give you a better financial return for investing locally. So I am of the belief that there are positive and negative impacts, or what we would call externalities in econ terms, on every transaction, and that the goal is to get all their positive, negative impacts, and the goal is to get all money doing as much positive impact as possible.
Yeah, I think what I love is the emphasis on relationship, and that money ultimately is a conduit. It's a tool. I think I saw a quote from you. I'm paraphrasing it, but just talking about how we use typically in our traditional asset management, one or two tools in a 50 toolbox. And we expect to, one, get the returns that are possible from a financial perspective, but also improve our communities, feel better about the work that we're doing on a social and environmental perspective. So what I love is that through story and connection and through relationship, you're helping people see, like, ultimately this is how business was intentionally designed for centuries and how it's been structured and how we kind of lost sight of that. There are many things that have been good about globalization and kind of the institutionalization and all these different things, but we've almost in some level dehumanized the marketplace and removed the person and made it a decision devoid of flesh. You know, like those, when you are headquartered in New York and you've got to cut some from your budget, and those are people in the Detroit office. It's a lot easier when you're removed from that. And so I think connecting people to story and relationship is a powerful thing. I was curious too, because like every time you and I talk, I loved what you said, and I don't want to like skip over it. You said if it's a group of 50, it gets really, really hard. I can imagine that's equally difficult, like on a website or in mass marketing, to really kind of get what you're doing in a format that's accessible. How have you found that medium? Because what you do is amazing, and if the mission of moving $1 trillion in $1 billion increments or whatever it might be, to really help shape and inform these family offices, how do you get in front of the 8-person crowd? How are you working to kind of solve for that problem as you move forward? Because it's quite complex, and you go to the Impact Finance Center website and there's a lot of great resources, but it's rather academic. And so how do you translate the academic and everything that you're doing into what really is a 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 type conversation?
That's a great question. And we're actually just in the process of rebranding right this second and working with we have our first CMO. We've never had money for a marketing or PR budget in our life. And so we are in that place of going through that process right now. But there's two different stories I'd like to share with you related to that. So one, for anybody who's listening who has that expertise, please call us and help us out. We want your help, because we're essentially a family of brands. We have multiple social enterprises, which you can relate to. One of the most exciting transactions right now, we haven't figured out how to share it in a way that's understandable in an easy way, is a case study we're working on with the Reese Foundation. So people have heard about us primarily through word of mouth. So we offer one-on-one training, small group training, and large group training. And so generally I think it's people have learned about us by attending our conferences, our 200 education events. And so luckily now we have a bit of a waiting list of different types of individuals and organizations with resources wanting to get trained, which is our goal. And so we have this amazing brother and sister with the Reese Foundation. Kyle was at Ford for 25 years, so he understands institutional philanthropy really well. He's now at TechSoup, who is one of our partners. They were lovely. Ken and Kyle came to our Colorado Impact Days conference, and I could see it right there. If people don't know TechSoup, they're absolutely amazing. They're the largest civil society organization in the world. With last year, they distributed $2 billion of software to 1 million nonprofits. They're the first for-profit or nonprofit doing a 50-state direct public offering. And I said, oh, we should partner. And I think they were like, what? And they came back a month later and they said, it's taken us 9 months to teach one of our corporate foundations how to invest in our 50-state DPO. We get it. We're not the expert in investor education. Will you be our investor education partner? That's for our 160 corporations that donate software to us to teach them how to invest in us with the direct public offering? And so Kyle also is with TechSoup, but he has this other hat as a family foundation. And so something interesting, the Ford quote of that if you ask people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, is certainly true. Could not be more true in this situation. So Impact Finance Center in the last 3 years has activated about 85 investors. And most of them are on their 3rd to 20th activity. And I don't say investments because an activity might be evaluating your investment advisor, which is probably the most important activity you could take, but it's not an investment. And so the hardest part is finding them and activating them. And I think if you would have given me a multiple choice test and said, here's 1,000 potential investors you will activate within 3 to 4 years in Colorado, I would have gotten an F-. I probably would have gotten 12 right out of that 85. So one, my ability to predict who's going to be an early adopter is not, I have no ability to do that.
It is quite fascinating.
It's somebody who, it's an individual or a group that thinks independently.
Yeah, it's not normally the people that everybody says, oh, you should talk to this group.
Absolutely. If you look at our list of 85, probably 75 are no names from the perspective of you have not heard of them yet. And so I was wrong on who would be. So I realized from an economist, you're trained for stated preferences and revealed preferences. So for our perspective, it's like, if you want to move and you're willing to do that next step, we'll work with you. If you slow down, get in the back of the line. We're going to encourage another individual or family office or foundation to get ahead of it. The other piece from the website design, which is horrific, is we have about 70 tools in the toolbox right now. I'm always wrong where they want to start. So you can take 4 different categories: overall governance of your money, your endowment, your philanthropy, your direct investing. I'll say, I know where Bryce is going to want to start. He's going to want to start on direct investing in CDFIs in Kentucky. And you'll come and say, I actually want to evaluate my investment advisor and do evidence-based decision attribution evaluation after you watch our course. So I feel like and I invite because the infrastructure we're creating is created for all of us. We need to figure out how to communicate that well, to invite everybody to the table and give them the buffet in a way that it's not overwhelming and a hurricane, so they can have like a little, hors d'oeuvre taste. And then what's most important is, and this is where our system is not set up for becoming a brand new impact investor, is people are constantly selling what they want to sell versus going, what does your first step want to be?
I love that.
Because when we studied the PRI capital, I have a data set from a few years ago, there was an R-square of 0.73 for foundation asset size and making your first transaction. And what that means in English is, if you did one transaction, you would do a second transaction regardless of the outcome.
Just because of the experience.
So our issue is, you take, we have a large billionaire in Colorado, and I could take a handful of 100 transactions out of a bag in Colorado, and he's going to like 93 of them. But guess what? The first 5 that went to him were the 7
exactly
that he wouldn't like. And I get why my colleagues and friends are like, I have an introduction to the billionaire, I'm going to go pitch my thing. But we're sitting back one level away going, what does that billionaire need to see for that first transaction to activate him?
Yeah.
Because if he gets activated, then we can get him to do a second one and a third one and a fourth one. So it's just a different game.
That's good. Well, you heard it here, folks. It's our infrastructure. And if you're creative, we need your help, because I think what Stephanie's hitting on is true, because it's complicated. It's not complicated. It's really relational, but capturing that and translating that to the masses. So if you're interested, I'm sure you can reach out to Stephanie, and she'd love to connect and figure out how to plug you into the work. So I would love to keep going, but we've been chatting for a while. On another note, at some point, this is off topic, but I'd love to pick your brain. I've got 4 daughters, and one of them is starting her own business. So I'd love to get your best practices for an 11-year-old girl who's starting her natural dog treat business. So just given your 12-year experience, but that's a whole nother conversation.
You laugh. I had several. So we're structured as 3 full-time staff, 60 part-time staff, 10 to 15 students at a time, an offshore data team, and then now over 150 senior advisors. So we'd love, for one, you to join us as a senior advisor. But one of our senior advisors just pitched us yesterday, or a week or 2 ago, has a friend and says, I want to develop a curriculum for youth for impact investing. And so that's actually in the play. That's
awesome.
Already in the interest. There's about 7 or 8 of the advisors interested in doing that. So
let's work on that. That'd be great.
Doing that and the business piece is super valuable. And I think the holy grail is there is enough. There's enough for the workers. There's enough for the founders. There's enough for the community, and there's enough for the investors. And so it's exciting. It's the most exciting time in my life right now, watching people adapt and respond so quickly. And it's like, oh my gosh, how do we get this playbook out to so many more people faster?
If you've enjoyed today's conversation and want to learn more about our overall approach to structuring and deploying capital, then download our white paper on the One Pocket Mindset at accessventures.org. Thanks again for listening to More Than Profit. And if you've liked what you've heard, then do us a favor by subscribing and leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Bryce Butler with Access Ventures. Thanks for listening.